Imagine a place, a manifestation of the imagination, a place where you can create. We are at one of the UK's most amazing writers or poets with a physical challenge, Alexander Pope's Grotto. Yes, hey people, it's Maleeka from Meeks VIP. Right now, I am at the entrance to Alexander Pope's Grotto. Meet Judith Hawley, Professor of English at the Royal Holloway University.
Let me describe some of the processes that the grotto has been through. When Pope built it, it was lined in brick, and then he covered the brick with a variety of different stones, and it went through different phases. It was first quite pretty, there were sort of shell patterns, pretty shiny stones. Later in life, he extended it at the front, and he put this, what you can see now is this very rough, it's called a rusticated stone entrance, so it looks more like a natural cave. He was more interested not so much in the sort of patterns that he was making, but he wanted to make it look like a mine. So he put in supports which looked like kind of props you have in a natural quarry or mine, and then he put in layers of stone, strata, geological strata. So the state it's in now is kind of a bit of a mess. It doesn't quite represent the way it was at any particular moment in Pope's life. It represents what people have done to it after his life.
Do you think the grotto still has its legacy? Do you think people will still be able to remember this and still respect it in the way they did when Pope was still alive?
It has different significance now because it was a retreat for Pope, and it's also a retreat in political terms. He was in the political opposition, and people would come here for that reason. I think people now come here because they're interested in Pope the poet, and they're interested in the sort of spirit of place. He wrote a lot about the importance of, he imagined there were, as in classical times, muses and nymphs living down here. So people are coming for that sense of inspiration again too. And we are working very hard to get it preserved. We can't restore it to the state it was in when Pope was alive, but we're definitely preserving it for future generations.
Would it be right to describe it as like an inspirational fantasy of his?
Yes, it was. He was trying to recreate something that was in his reading. He'd read about grottos and caves in classical literature, but then also he turned it into something. It took on a life of its own. He talks about being able to sit inside and seeing the light from the river reflected on the sparkly stones and mirrors that he put there. So it's like when you see a rainbow. The rainbow doesn't really exist. The rainbow is an effect created by the combination of sunlight and rainwater and the human eye. Mm-hmm. And the mind turning that combination of data into something beautiful. And when he was in the grotto, there's this combination of space, light, water, and imagination.
The perfect mix.
The perfect mix.
Right now, we are in one of the chambers or rooms of this grotto. Around us, we have lanterns which have been placed to kind of preserve the light and keep it lit up. But the floor, it's very, very uneven, and it's like a cobblestone kind of stone design with bricks and like random patches of kind of light and dark. The walls are very, very, very rough and tactile, and it reminds me so much of nature, like a cave that has been so beautifully designed by the water that's been kind of rushing past. But as you can tell, it's a very, very, very dark environment, but also very, very calming. And it's very quiet down here as well, as you can't really hear from up in the real world that up there. But it helps me think, and it helps me just kind of process ideas, because it's a very, very, very stimulated place for the brain and the mind, as it's very like tranquil, and it just thinks of something that's kind of out of this world, but it's still natural enough for you to feel relaxed and at home. I feel like Alexander Pope, he needed a place to escape to because of all the criticism and ridicule he faced because of his back, his posture, his TB, and he was always told to stand up straight, stand up straight. But what if he didn't want to? What if he wanted to look at the world from a different angle? And this is the place where he could do it. He could write, he could see nature, he could see all the beautiful things he had collected, and he could see his gardens. And this is a place where he felt safe and he felt that he was accepted, which is one of the things that many people want us to do. And even though he thought it was too perfect, even though he wanted to change it to make it more perfect by making it more natural, it still represented something. It represented a safe place for him and where he could be creative and the imagination could run wild.
One thing I would point out about it is that it's not all that big. I mean, he had a big villa upstairs. And Maleeka, you mentioned his curved spine. He was, in metric terms, he was probably about 1.37 meters tall, 4'5". He's quite a small man. And I feel as if he's built this grotto to his own scale. For his taller friends, they would have to stoop. They'd have to be, quite careful with their limbs. Whereas this rather petite man, it would fit him. So he's created a world that suits his imagination, but also is built to scale for him.
Meet Giles Abbott. He's a storyteller and a VIP, like me.
Some years ago, I was commissioned by Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust to create a story to celebrate Alexander Pope, his imagination, his poetry, his grotto, and his legacy to us.
What inspired you to do this? What does it mean to you?
I think what it means to me is I'm a disabled person. I'm visually impaired.
Like me.
Yeah. And Alexander Pope struggled all of his life with very critical disability. He was in pain pretty much every moment of every day and night. And I'm very well aware of how I was able to rebuild my life after losing my sight with help from friends and family and the welfare state. For Alexander Pope, there was no such thing. There was friends, there was family, and that was it. And he was able to use his talent and his ability, which in my small way I've been doing as well. And his success is astonishing. He became the most celebrated writer of his age. He changed the way that England looks, because what we think of as English landscape gardening was essentially his invention. And it started here.
Alexander Pope, as you said, he had a challenge in life. He had his TB. And he was constantly reminded to stand up straight, to raise your back and look up, because it looks ridiculous, it looks bad. But think about this. This is something I thought. He didn't need to stand up straight. There's too many people who look forward and see the world from here. Why can't people look from down here?
And get a different perspective.
What I'm basically trying to say is that Alexander Pope, because of his TB, he has a different perspective on pretty much everything in his life. Let me give you a more simplified example. Pick up a pen or a piece of paper or anything on your table and look at it at eye level. You see a pen and paper, don't you? Alexander Pope, because of his different posture, he saw the pen and paper from a little bit above, so he had to look up at it. And that kind of symbolises that, look, this pen and paper, it holds power. Because things that you look up to, the things that you stare up at, they represent things that are powerful, things that are superior. So if you want to look at it symbolically, that means the pen and paper are very useful and they're very important in being able to be a successful writer. And that pretty much is Alexander Pope's future, a successful poet/writer. I believe that Alexander Pope, he was a pioneer in looking down, but also looking up while doing so. He was always physically looking down, but his morals and his spirit was looking up towards the sky, because he always had that inspiration, he always had his imagination, which meant something. And we have to make sure that there's more people who accept themselves, because maybe you are in a wheelchair, maybe you do have TB, maybe you have cancer, but just because you're in a different position, you shouldn't ever discredit yourself, because it's important to remember that people need to be in those positions to see the world in a different way.
I agree that being in a different position in life, physically or economically or spiritually or politically, immediately gives you a different perspective, which is of value. And you talk about Alexander Pope always being told to stand up straight. It's still in our language. You talk about somebody being crooked.
got crippled.
Well, yeah, but also, we talk about, somebody, oh no, you can trust him, he's a straight up fellow. Yeah, it's still in our language that physical contortion is somehow related to not being honest. It's perhaps unavoidable the way that you judge the world instinctively, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be challenged. And I think it's amazing that Alexander Pope was able to... Well, I think one of the things that drove him, particularly in his gardening, because if you go to Hampton Court, which everybody in West London would have known about, you will see plants, trees, tortured and twisted into unnatural shapes, because that was the style of gardening made famous by Louis in France and copied by everybody else. What Alexander Pope did was, with reference to classical materials, he allowed plants and trees to achieve their natural perfection of form, so they look like trees. And I think for somebody who was, in his own life, unable to achieve anything like a human natural perfection of form, I think that was something that he understood the value of. And I don't know the exact quotation, or popation as I like to call them. It won't be exactly accurate, but somewhere in his essay on man, he writes that, Judith, I'm sure will be able to correct me, in spite of pride, in vanity's despite, one thing is clear, whatever is right. Now, that's a hard thing to say if you're as critically disabled as Alexander Pope was. But I understand that, because I've been visually impaired for over 20 years and I have learnt so much from my experience, and my life is a happy and a fulfilling one that I can't imagine changing it. It feels right that I'm visually shafted, even though it's awkward. So there's an acceptance that comes with it, and I think Pope achieved that as well.
It's a living contradiction, because just because you're different, just because you look as if you cannot speak the truth, you can. Obviously, Alexander did. He used poetry to criticise constructive criticism against others, to prove a point that truth has to remain intact and you have to speak the truth. Do you think that just because he was ridiculed and he was told he was imperfect, do you think this Grotto represented what he wanted to be, or was it just a manifestation of his imagination?
I think that's a very good question. I think anybody who gardens takes whatever space they have to make their walled garden their little piece of paradise. Paradise, in fact, comes from a Persian word which means a walled garden. And every gardener in their little square, however big or how small, tries to make their piece of the world as they feel the world should be. Alexander Pope did it in a remarkably original way in his time, and in a way which became imitated across England, and it's now known worldwide as the style of English landscape gardening. And it started here in Twickenham, in the imagination of a 4'6" man crippled with Pott's disease and in absolute pain. And despite his pain and his, quotes, deformity, he managed to create a vision of peace and perfection, which is now known all over the world.
For example, that twig he took from the basket from the lady when he met. Yes, that twig. I'm wondering, so he preserved that twig, he kept it and he watered it and he kept it like alive, and it grew into a new kind of breed of tree, I would say.
Yes, the story is that the twig that he got from the basket, which was a gift to Lady Suffolk, I think, when they were at Hampton Court, became the first weeping willow tree planted in London and therefore England.
What other symbolism do you see throughout his grotto?
I think for Alexander Pope this was a place of, yes, imagination, of romance, the idea of a temple to the muses. But I always feel that, yes, I feel there's a sense of protection as well, of safety. So this was a place where he could cross the road without having to fight with the busy traffic that cut him off from his own garden, and a place that he could retreat to his safe space is a politically fashionable term at the moment. I think this really was, because you could only enter it at his invitation. And so he had to struggle so hard to get on, well, to see eye to eye with the able-bodied world. Here, as Judith said earlier, this was built on his scale, on his terms, at his cost, and at his direction. So I think he would have felt nourished, nurtured and protected in this place. Yes.
You know that phrase of spitting blood? He literally did when he first started out with TB. And that means speaking the truth. What do you think of living your life so you accept your challenge?
I honestly think it's the only way to be happy, is to reach a sense of balance and accommodation with yourself and the challenges you face. The extraordinary thing for me with Alexander Pope is that he started his life outside normal society because his family were outcast in the sense that they were Catholic and England was Protestant. And then when he was 12 years old, he got critically ill. And this gave him, I should think, great isolation and great loneliness, but that's also a gift of time spent with yourself, in which he was able to read deeply and write and write and write, and just by sheer repetition, bring to a state of perfection his skills as a writer. And so without that experience, I don't know that he would have had the time or the chance or the opportunity. I personally feel without the years of disability that I suffered when my eyesight went, I also was partially paralysed for a few years, and that was my mid-20s wiped out. So instead of spending my mid-20s falling out of more pubs and getting into more scrapes, I had a very long period of time with myself where I was able to work on establishing skills which I could use in different ways. And I think Pope had the same. The most amazing thing about Pope, I think, is I think he formulated his vision when he was very young. He wrote a poem, it's a translation from a Horace, the Latin poet, the first verse of which goes, "Happy the man whose wish and care a few paternal acres bound, content to breathe his own air on his own ground." Well, that's a vision of being content because you live in your own property, in your own space. It belongs to you. You don't owe it to anybody else. He wrote that when he was 14. And he was able to achieve that in his late 20s when he became rich from his translations of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And he spent his life living on his own ground and knowing this is mine, and did it so successfully that other people came and copied. Last month I was performing in the Grotto, which belongs to the Earl of Shaftesbury, which was done, inspired by this, by William Kent at somebody else's expense. Alexander Pope did all of this at his own expense, and for a man who barely could stand, by God, he stood on his own 2 feet. And I think that's inspirational to anybody with any disability.
What is your passion? What is your creativity? And what is your imagination? Alexander Pope, he had kind of a hard life. He had a physical challenge. He did something about it though. He made this place, this grotto, where he felt safe and he could live his own life, the life he wanted to live. And that's a very important message, and we have to preserve it. We have to make sure that message does not disappear.
Oh, and that tree? That little strip that I mentioned from Lady Suffolk's basket? Tradition says that is the first weeping willow that was ever cultivated in England, and that all weeping willows are descended from that. So what is Pope's legacy to us? Well, I think he proves that you can imagine the world and thereby change it. That you can think how the world should be, and in your own lifetime see it becoming more that way, and pass on that message to succeeding generations. And I would leave you with a thought, which I'd like you to remember every time you see a weeping willow. Pope's legacy asks us a question. If we can change the world by imagining a better place and then working towards it, what do we dare imagine now? Now, as our temples to curiosity, our museums are struggling, as our schools are crumbling, and as our libraries all over the country are going dark for the last times, what dare we imagine for a better future? And don't be downhearted. The heaviest thing you'll ever need to pick up to start the work is a goose feather. Thank you.